As we continue our series on the feasts, today we're talking about Holy and Great Pascha, Easter, the resurrection. And I want to begin with the word Pascha and why we as Orthodox use the word Pascha when we're talking about the Feast of the Resurrection. Pascha is the Greek word for Passover. In Hebrew, the Passover is Pesach. And so Pascha is just the Greek word for Passover. So first, it's important to know that we as Greek Orthodox Christians celebrate Passover. But it's the new Passover. Christ made a new Passover, a new Pascha. In fact, in the Scriptures, St. Paul refers to Christ as the new Passover, the new Pascha, the new sacrificial lamb. And so, briefly, what was the Feast of Passover in the Old Testament? In the Old Testament, the Feast of Passover commemorated being liberated from Egypt. Part of it was that during the many plagues that Egypt was suffering because they had enslaved the Jewish people, God says the angel of death is going to come. And he told the Jews to take the blood of the lamb and put it on your doorstop, and there was a special symbol that they used. And when the angel of death sees that blood, it knows that you belong to me, and the angel of death will pass over that house, and everyone will be saved. So, when Christ came 2,000 some odd years ago, because we have his blood in our heart, in our baptism, in our chrismation, in Holy Communion, we have taken Christ into us. And when we receive Holy Communion, the blood of Christ, the blood of the new Pascha lamb, is on our hearts. And so the angel of death passes over us. And that's why we prefer the word Pascha as opposed to Easter. We don't get into a big fasseria about it, we don't go into a big problem about it, but that is why we prefer the word Pascha, because it identifies that God has saved us and that we belong to him and that we have been freed from the devil. Just as the Jews were freed from Egypt, we now are freed from the devil. So we celebrate Pascha. It is known in the church as the Feast of Feasts. You know, this series is called the 12 Great Feasts. But Pascha is actually not one of the 12 Great Feasts. It stands in a category above. It is the Feast of Feasts. It is the feast that gives every other feast meaning. Okay? And then finally, we know it's a celebration of the resurrection of Christ. We know that. And I just want to clarify for lack of a better word, an urban legend in the calculation of Pascha. When do we celebrate Pascha? First, you know, I like to share sometimes my pet peeves with people, right? Some things that bother me. There's no such thing as Greek Easter, right? There's no such thing as Greek Easter. There's Greek Orthodox Easter, but there's no Greek Easter, right? You get me, right? Because as Orthodox, we're not all just Greeks. Some of us are Serbians, some of us are Russians, some of us are Americans, right? So it's Orthodox Easter, and it does have a different time on the calendar normally than the Western Church. But there's an urban legend about that. I bet you've heard that the reason our Pascha is later than the Western Easter is because we have to wait for Passover before we can celebrate the resurrection of Christ, because Christ was crucified on Passover. Raise your hand if you've ever heard that. Anybody ever heard that? We have to wait for the Passover, everybody says. Not true. Not true at all. We do not have to wait for the Passover. The reason it looks like we're waiting for the Passover is because coincidentally we use the similar formula than the Jews in terms of celebrating the date for the resurrection. In the very earliest centuries of the church, there was, believe it or not, no standardization on when the resurrection was celebrated. Each community had their own calculation of when to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. And they knew the calculation of Passover, and they knew that Christ was crucified on the Friday of Passover. And so each community was kind of formulating this formula, that formula, this formula. And there were many different possible dates for the celebration of the resurrection of Christ. Even getting so difficult that in the same city, some churches were celebrating the resurrection on a Thursday or a Tuesday or a Sunday. It wasn't even always on a Sunday. And so in the 4th century, in the 300s, the church got together, and one of the issues at the First Ecumenical Council was the calculation of Pascha. When are we going to celebrate the resurrection? And it was determined in the year 325 that we would celebrate the resurrection of Christ on the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the spring equinox. And a letter from the emperor went out to the entire empire and said that the council, remember all these bishops at the First Ecumenical Council, agreed this is the formula. So something important to think about here. From the time of Christ to the year 325, there was no standard formula. And in 325, the bishops agreed to the formula. And a letter goes out to the people from the emperor, and one of the things he said was, do not depend upon the calculation of the Jews. We will give you our calculation. And the understanding was there, first of all, you have to put yourself in the historic frame of mind. The Jews failed to recognize who Christ was. Why would we trust their calculations? Why would we, and what people used to do, wait until the rabbis would say when Passover was? Then we can do it on our own. We don't have to wait for them. They weren't able to recognize the Messiah. So in 325, this letter goes out. But believe this or not, it wasn't until the 700s that finally the entire Christian world was celebrating the resurrection, celebrating Pascha on the same day, following this formula. The first Sunday, after the first full moon, after the spring equinox. So finally, after 700 and something years, the entire Christian world was unified on the day of Pascha. And then in I think it was the 1600s, it may have been earlier, but I think it was the 1600s, forgive me, I forgot to look it up. The Western Church, now at that point was called the Roman Catholic Church because they had split from the church in 1054, they developed a new calendar. Originally, the calendar was based on the moon, the lunar calendar. We call it the Julian calendar. The church in the West developed the Gregorian calendar, as it's known today, based on the sun. And it is a more accurate calculation of time. So, with this new clock, this new calendar, the Western Church said the first Sunday, after the first full moon, after the spring equinox, this is Easter Sunday. The Jews were still on the Julian calendar. Many of the churches now in the East, the Orthodox churches, had a problem. What's this calendar thing all about? Again, historic context. Did you ever hear the Crusades? The Crusades were basically the destruction of the Eastern Church by the Western Church. And so the bishops in the East said, wait a minute. You mean we're going to trust the people who just destroyed us? We're going to trust their formula? We're going to trust their calendar? And so the Eastern Church refused to use the new calendar for many, many centuries. And the world continued to split. The Western world having Easter based on one calendar, and the Eastern world having Easter, resurrection, Pascha on the other calendar. The difference is the two calendars calculate the equinox differently. And so if on the Gregorian calendar the equinox is this day, on the Julian calendar the equinox is a different day. And so it sends Pascha to a different month sometimes. This coming year, our Pascha is very late. April 28th, I think, is Pascha in 2019. I think it's 3 weeks after the Western Easter. Not because we're waiting for Passover, not because we're waiting for the Jewish Passover, but because our calendar is different. Okay, so whenever you hear somebody say, we have to wait for the Jews, it's not true. It happens to be coincidence that we use the same calendar than with the Jews instead of the Western Church. Okay, so I think it's important for us to know what Pascha means and when we celebrate it. The last thing, what time is it? How much time do we have? It's 44. The last thing is, of course, that we as Orthodox Christians view everything in life through the eyes of the resurrection. Right? So everything that we talk about every day, every Sunday, the 12 great feasts that we've been talking about, always through the lens of the resurrection on the Feast of Pascha. So